that drug trafficking has no place in our communities anywhere.
At 4:19 a.m., on a frozen stretch of Highway 52 in southern Minnesota, a routine winter traffic stop quietly crossed a line that federal agencies spend years trying to detect. The road was dark and nearly empty, locked in the deep stillness that comes with extreme cold. A semi-truck carrying a regional freight logo slowed to the shoulder for what appeared to be a standard seasonal inspection, the kind conducted thousands of times every winter across the upper Midwest. There were no sirens, no pursuit, and no visible sign that anything unusual was about to happen. On the surface, it was simply another check meant to keep icy highways safe. That impression began to change as inspectors worked through the technical process. When concealed compartments were finally exposed, the stop shifted immediately from a transportation matter into a federal security concern. Investigators encountered narcotics sealed for long-distance winter transport, including cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl, alongside materials that pointed toward risks extending beyond drug trafficking. At that moment, the discovery still appeared isolated, serious, but contained. What no one on that frozen highway yet understood was that this single stop had opened the first crack in a much larger structure, one that would soon force federal authorities to reassess how deeply hidden threats could move inside America's supply chains. Subscribe to Military Power to follow how this single winter stop revealed a threat moving quietly through America's supply chains. As the investigation advanced beyond the initial traffic stop in Minnesota, federal attention turned to the information provided by the detained driver, because his account suggested the situation involved more than a single vehicle. Investigators reported that the driver described a group of 83 truck drivers connected to North Star Hauling who operated under a separate internal coordination system. Most of these drivers were Somali men, and they were assigned duties that differed from those of the wider employee base. This early detail led authorities to treat the case as a potential organizational issue rather than an isolated violation. According to investigative summaries, the drivers identified by the suspect shared a common operational framework. They were assigned trailers that had been modified in the same manner, allowing the equipment to be used consistently across multiple assignments. From the outside, these trailers appeared identical to standard commercial units used throughout the Midwest. This outward normality allowed them to move through routine checkpoints and loading facilities without raising immediate concern, which investigators later recognized as a key factor in their continued operation. Records reviewed during this phase of the inquiry showed that the drivers followed fixed routes across several Midwestern states. These routes repeatedly connected terminals in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, South Dakota, and Illinois. Unlike typical freight operations that adjust routes based on seasonal demand, weather disruptions, or fuel costs, these movements remained largely unchanged. Investigators interpreted this stability as an indicator that the routes were selected for reasons unrelated to commercial efficiency. The timing of these trips also drew attention. Many of the movements took place during nighttime hours, when traffic density is lower and inspection activity is reduced. Operating at night allowed the drivers to blend into the steady flow of long-haul freight that routinely travels after business hours. From a law enforcement perspective, this made it more difficult to distinguish between ordinary transport activity and movements that required closer scrutiny. Within North Star facilities, officials identified patterns that further supported the existence of a distinct group. Internal activity logs showed that certain loading zones and maintenance areas were used repeatedly by the same drivers. Trailer movements were recorded during periods when winter conditions often limited normal inbound or outbound operations. In some instances, documentation did not align with standard commercial practices, prompting investigators to question whether separate instructions were being followed. Federal authorities emphasized that the importance of the driver statements lay in their consistency rather than their detail. The description of 83 drivers operating under shared rules, using standardized equipment, and following fixed schedules pointed to a coordinated approach. Such a level of uniformity suggested that the activity was organized and sustained over time, rather than the result of independent actions by individual drivers. At this stage, investigators did not treat the information as definitive proof of wrongdoing by every individual involved. Instead, the statements were used as a guide to focus further examination of company records, personnel assignments, and operational data. What began as a routine winter traffic stop had now raised broader questions about how a coordinated group could operate within a legitimate freight company, and this realization marked a critical step toward deeper federal scrutiny of North Star Hauling's internal operations. As federal agencies reviewed the growing body of evidence, officials reached a clear conclusion that a limited or gradual response would fail to contain the situation. The investigation had identified activity spread across several states, involving mobile assets, fixed facilities, and personnel who followed predictable routines. Under these conditions, authorities determined that a single coordinated enforcement action offered the best chance to prevent evidence loss and operational disruption. This decision led to the launch of Operation Northern Breaker, a multi-state effort designed to apply pressure across the entire system at the same time. Planning for Northern Breaker focused on coordination rather than speed alone. Federal planners recognized that piecemeal arrests or isolated searches could alert remaining subjects and trigger rapid adjustments. To avoid this risk, agencies aligned their timelines so that enforcement activity would begin simultaneously across all identified locations. This approach aimed to preserve the integrity of records, maintain control over key sites, and limit the opportunity for individuals to relocate or conceal materials. The operational scope of the campaign extended across 5 Midwestern states, reflecting the geographic spread identified during the investigation. Actions were conducted in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, South Dakota, and Illinois. Each state had been linked to specific movements, facilities, or personnel associated with the case. Coordinating across state lines required advanced planning, shared command structures, and clear communication channels to ensure that each team operated under the same objectives and legal framework. Highway operations formed one component of the response. Law enforcement units were positioned along selected routes to conduct traffic stops involving vehicles connected to the investigation. These stops were scheduled to coincide with other enforcement actions, ensuring that vehicles already in transit could be secured without creating gaps elsewhere. Authorities emphasized public safety during these operations, conducting them in a controlled manner appropriate for winter driving conditions. Freight terminals represented another priority. Teams moved to secure access points at facilities identified during the investigative phase. By controlling entry and exit, officers were able to stabilize operations and prevent unauthorized movement of vehicles or goods. This step also allowed investigators to preserve operational records and equipment for subsequent review. Timing was critical, as terminal actions were synchronized with highway activity to prevent overlap or interference. Warehouse and storage sites were addressed as part of the same coordinated effort. These locations had been identified through operational data and administrative records rather than on-scene activity alone. Enforcement teams secured the premises and documented conditions as they found them. Winter weather added logistical complexity, but preparations ensured that communication and safety protocols remained effective throughout the operation. Residential locations associated with coordination and administrative roles were included as well. Serving warrants at these addresses during the same time window reduced the likelihood of communication between subjects in different locations. This measure was intended to limit the spread of information that could compromise other enforcement actions underway. From a strategic perspective, Northern Breaker reflected a deliberate choice to prioritize containment over gradual escalation. Federal officials sought to establish control across all known points of activity in a single phase. By doing so, they aimed to prevent fragmentation of the case and preserve a clear chain of evidence. The coordinated nature of the operation marked a turning point, shifting the case from investigation to enforcement and setting the foundation for the outcomes that would follow in the subsequent phase of the response. After enforcement actions stabilized the immediate situation, federal investigators expanded their analysis to evaluate the overall function of North Star hauling within the case. This review led to the conclusion that the company did not operate solely as a conventional freight carrier. While its public filings and commercial activity aligned with industry norms, the cumulative evidence suggested the presence of a parallel logistics role that existed alongside routine transportation services. On the surface, North Star appeared similar to many regional carriers operating in the Midwest. Company records described the movement of consumer goods, industrial materials, and seasonal freight tied to winter demand. These categories typically involve high-volume traffic and frequent schedule changes, conditions that reduce the likelihood of close inspection on a shipment-by-shipment basis. Investigators recognized that this environment allowed the company to maintain a low profile within the broader supply chain. Further examination indicated that several North Star terminals did not function strictly as transit locations. Instead of serving only as points where cargo passed through, certain facilities were identified as playing a more active role in the movement of goods. This observation was based on administrative data rather than physical inspection, and it suggested that these terminals supported a distribution function that extended beyond standard freight handling. Federal analysts stressed that this assessment was not based on a single factor. Patterns in scheduling, internal coordination, and facility utilization collectively pointed to a structure operating in parallel with legitimate business activity. While each element on its own might have appeared consistent with normal operations, their alignment over time led investigators to reassess the company's operational profile. From a strategic perspective, officials compared the observed model to logistics concepts commonly discussed in military planning. In those contexts, parallel supply systems are designed to ensure continuity and control, while remaining difficult to detect. Investigators noted similarities in how North Star's activities appeared embedded within civilian freight flows, though they avoided detailed descriptions of internal processes. This comparison underscored the seriousness of the findings without revealing sensitive operational detail. Authorities also considered how the company's legitimate operations contributed to its resilience. By continuing standard commercial activity, North Star maintained regulatory compliance and market presence, which reduced suspicion. This overlap between lawful business and the parallel logistics role helped explain how the activity persisted over an extended period without immediate detection. The identification of North Star as more than a standard trucking company had significant implications. It shifted the focus of the case from individual incidents to systemic vulnerability within the transportation sector. Federal agencies began to view the matter as an example of how civilian supply chains could be exploited for purposes beyond commerce. This perspective would inform subsequent discussions about oversight, risk management, and policy responses as the investigation progressed into its next phase. As the investigation expanded beyond physical locations and transportation activity, federal authorities shifted focus to the financial records associated with North Star hauling. This phase centered on understanding how ownership structures and money flows supported the company's operations. What emerged from financial reviews was a pattern that differed sharply from the expectations for a regional freight business operating in the Midwest. Investigators identified links between the company's ownership and a network of shell entities that lacked clear commercial purpose. These companies were registered with minimal public information, and in several cases they shared overlapping addresses or administrative contacts. Such arrangements are commonly associated with efforts to obscure beneficial ownership rather than conduct ordinary trade. For regulators, this raised immediate concerns about transparency and accountability within the corporate structure. Financial records also revealed extensive use of informal money transfer channels. Rather than relying solely on traditional banking systems, funds moved through networks that operate outside standard licensing and reporting requirements. These channels allowed money to be transferred in fragmented amounts, reducing the likelihood that individual transactions would trigger automated alerts. Over time, however, aggregated data exposed the true scale of these movements. According to federal assessments, more than $85 million was transferred out of the United States through thousands of small transactions. The transfers were routed to overseas destinations using methods designed to resemble routine remittances. By breaking large sums into smaller amounts, the activity blended into normal financial traffic and avoided immediate detection by compliance systems. Authorities emphasized that the volume of money involved was inconsistent with the financial profile of a freight company managing seasonal demand and weather-related disruptions. Revenue streams associated with legitimate transport contracts did not account for the magnitude of outbound transfers observed. This discrepancy strengthened the conclusion that the financial activity served purposes beyond normal business operations. The timing and distribution of transfers further supported this assessment. Payments occurred regularly rather than sporadically, indicating sustained coordination over an extended period. Funds moved through multiple intermediary accounts before reaching their final destinations, complicating tracing efforts but also revealing deliberate structuring. For investigators, these patterns suggested planning rather than ad hoc behavior. Federal analysts were careful to frame these findings within a broader context. The financial structure did not operate in isolation, but appeared designed to support activity across national borders. While investigators avoided detailing specific mechanisms, they noted that the combination of shell entities and unlicensed transfer networks enabled money to move quietly between jurisdictions. From a national security perspective, this financial dimension elevated the significance of the case. Cross-border money flows tied to opaque corporate structures present risks that extend beyond regulatory violations. They can enable influence, sustain operations abroad, and undermine financial oversight systems. In this instance, the identified transfers highlighted how financial infrastructure can be used to support transnational activity while remaining concealed within legitimate commerce. By the conclusion of this phase, federal authorities had assembled a financial picture that complemented earlier findings. The links between North Star, shell companies, and unregulated transfer networks demonstrated that the case was not confined to transportation issues. Instead, it reflected a coordinated financial framework capable of moving large sums internationally with limited visibility. This understanding would play a critical role as the investigation advanced toward its final outcomes. As federal agencies reviewed the full timeline of the case, seasonal weather patterns emerged as a key factor influencing enforcement visibility across the Midwest. Harsh winter conditions routinely disrupt normal inspection rhythms, especially in regions where snow, ice, and extreme cold dominate for several months each year. During these periods, law enforcement agencies are required to divert resources toward traffic safety, accident response, and emergency services, which reduces the capacity available for detailed commercial inspections. Highway enforcement data show that winter storms significantly affect roadside operations. Icy conditions limit the ability to conduct extended vehicle checks, and reduced daylight hours further constrain visibility. In practice, this means that inspections often focus on immediate safety concerns rather than deeper cargo verification. Vehicles that appear compliant in documentation and outward condition are therefore less likely to undergo prolonged scrutiny during severe weather events. Federal authorities also observed that winter conditions slow response times across multiple agencies. Travel delays, hazardous roads, and staffing shortages caused by weather-related disruptions can extend the time required to coordinate follow-up actions. When inspections do occur, the ability to escalate findings quickly is often reduced, allowing questionable activity to continue longer before intervention becomes possible. Storage and transfer locations are similarly affected by seasonal patterns. During periods of extreme cold, access to terminals and warehouses can be restricted due to safety protocols or operational slowdowns. Non-essential personnel are often absent, and third-party contractors such as maintenance crews or inspectors may delay visits until conditions improve. This reduction in routine presence lowers the chance that irregular activity will be noticed through daily operations. Investigators reviewing historical records noted that transport and storage activity linked to the case frequently coincided with winter months. Over several years, movements appeared concentrated during periods when weather conditions were most likely to limit oversight. While winter is a normal feature of the regional climate, the repeated alignment of activity with these conditions suggested a consistent pattern rather than coincidence. Federal assessments emphasize that winter does not halt the flow of goods across the Midwest. Essential freight continues to move even during snowstorms and prolonged cold spells, particularly in sectors tied to food, fuel, and heating supplies. Supply chains remain active, and commercial transport is often encouraged to maintain continuity despite adverse conditions. This ongoing movement creates an environment in which large volumes of freight pass through enforcement zones at a time when inspection capacity is reduced. From an analytical standpoint, investigators viewed climate as an environmental factor that can shape enforcement effectiveness. Weather is typically treated as a logistical obstacle, but in this case, it influenced how oversight was applied. By anticipating periods of reduced inspection intensity, activity was able to persist without requiring constant adaptation or visible concealment. Federal officials stress that these observations do not imply that weather alone enables illicit activity. Rather, seasonal conditions can amplify existing vulnerabilities within enforcement systems that are already managing high workloads. When combined with routine commercial operations, winter weather can create temporary blind spots that delay detection. By identifying winter as a contributing factor, authorities gained a clearer understanding of why the activity remained undetected for an extended period. This insight carries broader implications for how enforcement agencies assess risk in regions with severe seasonal weather. It underscores the importance of accounting for environmental conditions when evaluating transportation oversight and national security exposure. As the case progressed, this understanding informed discussions about future preparedness and monitoring strategies across cold weather regions of the United States. By the time Operation Northern Breaker concluded, federal authorities had moved decisively from investigation to enforcement, producing outcomes that extended far beyond a single criminal case. Across the 5 states involved, all 83 truck drivers identified during the inquiry were taken into custody, along with dozens of individuals linked to warehouse operations and coordination roles. These arrests marked the complete shutdown of the transport network that had operated under the cover of a legitimate freight company. Seizures conducted during the operation confirmed the scale of the activity uncovered by investigators. Law enforcement agencies reported the confiscation of large quantities of narcotics, including cocaine, methamphetamine, and fentanyl, as well as millions of dollars in cash. According to case summaries, the volume of drugs and currency exceeded what is normally associated with regional trafficking cases, reinforcing the assessment that this was a long-term and organized effort rather than a series of isolated violations. North Star hauling itself was effectively removed from the commercial sector. Following the enforcement actions, federal authorities secured company facilities, restricted access to internal systems, and initiated asset control procedures. Bank accounts were frozen, terminals were placed under supervision, and fleet operations were halted. Within days, a company that had played a visible role in Midwestern freight movement ceased to function as a business entity. The shutdown produced immediate economic effects. Thousands of employees who were not accused of wrongdoing suddenly faced uncertainty as operations stopped. Regional freight capacity was temporarily reduced, requiring other carriers to absorb routes and shipments on short notice. State transportation officials and industry groups worked to stabilize essential supply flows, particularly for goods tied to food distribution, heating fuel, and industrial inputs. These short-term disruptions illustrated how closely freight companies are integrated into everyday economic life. Beyond the immediate enforcement results, federal agencies framed the case as a broader security warning. Investigators concluded that vulnerabilities within transportation and logistics oversight had allowed the activity to persist for years without detection. When such vulnerabilities are exploited, the consequences extend beyond criminal law enforcement and into national resilience, economic stability, and public safety. Authorities also highlighted the foreign-linked dimension of the case. Financial and administrative connections identified during the investigation raised concerns about external influence operating within domestic infrastructure. For this reason, the matter was treated not only as a law enforcement success, but as a homeland security issue. This classification prompted close coordination among federal agencies responsible for transportation, finance, and national security. In Washington, the findings triggered a review of oversight and regulatory frameworks governing the freight and logistics sector. Lawmakers and federal regulators examined how ownership structures are vetted, how cross-state operations are monitored, and how data sharing between agencies can be improved. Particular attention was paid to whether existing inspection and compliance systems were adequate to detect complex risks embedded in routine commercial activity. The case also influenced discussions about enforcement capacity. Federal officials acknowledged that agencies often operate under significant resource constraints, especially in regions with heavy commercial traffic or severe seasonal weather. Strengthening oversight may require additional staffing, improved analytical tools, and expanded interagency cooperation to reduce blind spots revealed by the investigation. From a strategic perspective, Operation Northern Breaker reshaped how supply chain security is viewed at the federal level. The outcome demonstrated that logistics networks are not simply economic assets, but critical infrastructure with national security implications. When compromised, these systems can be used in ways that undermine trust and stability across multiple sectors. As legal proceedings continued, federal authorities emphasized that the conclusion of the operation did not mark the end of scrutiny. Ongoing analysis of records and data remained underway to identify any remaining risks or related activity. The results of Northern Breaker stood as a clear enforcement success, but they also served as a cautionary example of how essential systems can be exploited when oversight fails. For policymakers and regulators, the case underscored the need for sustained vigilance to protect the supply chains that support daily life across the United States. This case shows how a single investigation can expose serious risks inside systems Americans rely on every day. Share your thoughts and subscribe to Military Power for clear, timely analysis on the stories that matter most.